A poor mechanic fixes a woman's boat for free, unaware she owns a luxury yacht empire and falls for him. The sea has a way of calling lost souls home. Some people spend their entire lives chasing after more money, more success, more control, only to realize too late that they've lost themselves along the way. Others, broken by the world, choose to retreat, seeking solitude in places untouched by time, hoping that the silence will heal what was shattered. This is a story about two such people. Lucas Kane, a man who walked away from everything, choosing the quiet isolation of an island where the only thing he needed to fix was broken boats, not broken hearts, and Stella Harrington, a woman who had everything, yet somehow felt nothing. A billionaire at the helm of a global yacht empire, searching for something she couldn't name, until fate led her to a storm, a stranded boat, and a man who would change everything. What happens when two worlds that were never meant to collide suddenly do? What if an act of kindness, a simple favor, sets off a chain of events that neither of them saw coming? What if the very thing they were running from was the only thing they truly needed? This is The Lighthouse Between Us. Story of love, redemption, and the power of second chances. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. If you believe in the magic of heartfelt stories, in the kind of love that heals, in the idea that kindness can change lives, then you're in the right place. Now, let's begin. The waves are waiting, the waves crash gently against the rugged shoreline, their rhythmic lullaby echoing through the quiet island. The scent of salt and damp wood lingered in the crisp morning air as Lucas stepped out of his small, weathered cabin. Dressed in his usual faded jeans and an old navy blue shirt, he ran a calloused hand through his graying hair and took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the place settle over him. To Lucas, solitude wasn't a curse, it was a choice. For years, he had called this remote island home, living in sync with the tides, the wind, and the ever-changing sky. The outside world, with its noise and expectations, had once held him captive, but he had walked away from it all. Here, among the broken boats and the endless sea, he had found a sort of peace. He made his way to the dock, where a half-repaired fishing boat rested on wooden beams. The island's fishermen relied on him to keep their vessels seaworthy, and in return they paid him with fresh fish, supplies, and the occasional bottle of whiskey. It was a simple exchange, one that kept him connected just enough to feel human, but not enough to tether him to anyone. He picked up his tools and was about to start work when he noticed something unusual. Out in the distance, a sleek, white yacht bobbed on the water, its hull gleaming under the golden morning sun. Lucas frowned. He rarely saw yachts this far out. The people who owned them had little reason to venture beyond the comfort of their private marinas and luxury resorts. But something was wrong. The yacht wasn't just drifting, it was tilting slightly to one side, moving sluggishly, as if it were in distress. Lucas grabbed his binoculars from the tool bench and focused on the vessel. The sails were down, and the engine appeared dead. A woman stood near the bow, waving something bright in the air. A red scarf, a signal for help. With a sigh, Lucas set his tools down and climbed into his small motorboat. He didn't particularly enjoy visitors, but he wasn't the type to ignore someone in need. Starting the engine, he navigated through the rolling waves, the salty spray hitting his face as he neared the stranded yacht. As he pulled alongside, he got his first clear look at the woman. She was striking, not in the delicate, fragile way of someone who had never known hardship, but in the way she carried herself. Even from a distance, Lucas could see the determination in her stance, the way she braced against the wind without hesitation. Her hair, a cascade of golden brown, was tousled by the sea breeze. She wore a light blouse and linen pants, both slightly damp from the ocean mist. But it was her eyes that caught Lucas off guard, deep, intelligent, and searching. "Thank God," she called out, her voice strong despite the worry in it. "My engine died and I have no signal out here. Can you help?" Lucas studied her for a moment before replying. "Depends what happened," she exhaled in relief, though his response hadn't exactly been welcoming. "I was sailing alone. Just needed some time away. Something went wrong with the engine, and I lost power. I've been stuck for hours." Lucas eyed the pristine yacht skeptically. "Not many people take a yacht like this out alone. What's your name?" She hesitated, then smiled wryly. "Stella. No last name, just Stella." Lucas didn't press. He didn't care who she was or where she came from. The ocean had a way of stripping people down to their core, leaving only what truly mattered. "All right, Stella," he said, pulling a rope to secure his boat to hers. "Let's see if I can get you moving again." She watched as he climbed. Aboard, his movements steady and sure. He was older than her, maybe in his early 40s, but there was something about him. Something solid, unshaken. Lucas crouched beside the engine panel, lifting the hatch with practiced ease. The moment he saw the tangled mess of wires, he let out a low whistle. "Whoever did the last maintenance on this should be fired," he muttered. Stella chuckled despite herself. "That bad? Bad enough that I'm surprised you made it. This far." He worked in silence, hands moving with an expertise that spoke of years spent fixing things others had given up on. Stella found herself watching him. Not just what he was doing, but how he was doing it. There was a quiet confidence about him, a man who didn't need to fill the air with empty words. Within 20 minutes, the engine sputtered to life. Stella blinked. "That's it?" Lucas wiped his hands on a rag. "That's it." She looked at him with genuine gratitude. "How much do I owe you?" Lucas shook his head. "Nothing." She frowned. "Nothing?" He leaned against the railing, eyes on the horizon. "I don't charge for helping someone in trouble. The sea's unpredictable. Next time, it might be me needing help." Stella studied him, her curiosity deepening. In her world, everything had a price. But here was a man who lived by a different code, one she couldn't quite understand yet. As she looked at the island in the distance, she made a sudden decision. "I don't suppose there's a place on that island where I can get a meal?" she asked, testing the waters. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You planning to stay?" She shrugged, a playful glint in her eye. "I figure I owe you dinner at the very least." For the first time in a long time, Lucas found himself almost smiling. "Suit yourself," he said. As he guided her yacht toward the shore, neither of them realized that this chance encounter would change their lives forever. The scent of salt and wood smoke lingered in the air as Lucas led Stella onto the shore. The island was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of waves lapping against the docks and the occasional cry of seabirds circling overhead. The sand was cool beneath their feet as they stepped onto the wooden pier, the old planks creaking under their weight. Stella took a deep breath, letting the raw, unfiltered beauty of the place sink in. It was a world away from the manicured perfection of luxury marinas and five-star resorts she was used to. Here, nature ruled, untamed, unpredictable, and breathtakingly real. Lucas walked a few steps ahead, his posture relaxed but distant. He wasn't the type to fill silences with unnecessary conversation, and Stella found herself intrigued by that. Most men she encountered in her world were eager to impress, their words carefully curated to flatter or negotiate. But Lucas, he had no such intentions. She followed him past a line of small, rustic boathouses to a cabin that stood slightly apart from the others. It was a simple structure, weathered wood, a porch lined with old fishing nets, and a lantern hanging by. The The windows glowed softly from the inside, the only sign of warmth in the otherwise rugged surroundings. Lucas pushed the door open and stepped aside, wordlessly inviting her in. Stella hesitated for just a moment before crossing the threshold. The interior was exactly what she expected. Functional, minimal yet strangely comforting. The air carried the scent of aged timber, salt and something faintly familiar. Cinnamon. A small stove crackled in the corner, a pot simmering on top. A well-worn bookshelf stood against the far wall, lined with books that had clearly been read more than once. Maps, old compasses, and nautical instruments were scattered across the wooden desk by the window. "You live here alone?" she asked, running her fingers along the edge of the bookshelf. Lucas set his keys down on the table. "Yeah." She glanced around, curiosity sparking. "For how long?" Lucas turned to the stove, lifting the pot's lid to stir its contents, before finally answering. "Almost 10 years." Stella blinked. 10 years. She had expected something along the lines of a few months, maybe a year, some temporary escape. But a decade, that wasn't just running away from the world, that was choosing a new one. "What made you stay?" she asked, watching him carefully. Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he ladled the contents of the pot, some kind of hearty stew, into 2 bowls and placed one in front of her. The steam rose between them as he finally spoke. "Didn't see much reason to leave." A vague answer, purposefully so. Stella knew deflection when she saw it, but she also knew better than to push too hard, too fast. Instead, she picked up her spoon and took a careful sip of the stew. It was surprisingly good, rich, warm, and spiced just enough to linger on her tongue. Unexpectedly delicious," she admitted. Lucas gave a slight shrug. "Cooking's just another kind of fixing. Same principles apply." That made her smile. "So you fix things, boats, meals, what else?" For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Lucas's otherwise unreadable face. "Not much else. Worth fixing." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt oddly natural. 2 strangers sitting across from each other, separated by worlds, yet bound by this one moment of shared simplicity. Stella set her spoon down and leaned back slightly. "You didn't ask me why I was out there alone." Lucas met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Didn't seem like my business." She studied him, searching for any sign of curiosity. Most people would have asked by now, probing for details, weaving assumptions, but Lucas, he didn't need to know, and that, oddly enough, made her want to tell him. "I needed to get away," she admitted. "From everything." Lucas didn't react, didn't press for more. He simply nodded, as if that answer alone was enough. But Stella wasn't sure it was. For years, she had been drowning in a world of power, wealth, and expectation. Owning a global luxury yacht empire sounded glamorous on paper, but in reality, it had become a golden cage. She had built her empire from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail in an industry dominated by men. She had earned her place, and yet the emptiness had crept in, slow at first, then all at once. It was in the endless board meetings, the superficial conversations at exclusive galas, the relentless demand to always be more powerful, more successful, more untouchable. But out there on the open water, with nothing but the horizon stretching before her, she had finally felt something close to freedom, until her engine failed, and fate had brought her here. She met Lucas's gaze again. His eyes were sharp, like he saw more than he let on. Maybe he did. Maybe he recognized something familiar in her, because something told her that he, too, had once needed to get away from everything. The thought unsettled her more than it should. "Have so," she said, shifting the conversation. "How do you spend your days here?" Lucas leaned back slightly. "Fixing boats. Fishing when I feel like it. Reading." She raised an eyebrow. Reading? He gestured toward the bookshelf. Got plenty of time. Stella stood and wandered over, scanning the titles. Hemingway, Melville, Steinbeck, and, surprisingly, some poetry collections. You read poetry? She asked, amused. Lucas didn't flinch. Sometimes. She pulled one from the shelf, flipping through the worn pages. Any favorites? For a long moment he didn't answer. Then just when she thought he wouldn't, he said, "The cure for anything is salt water, sweat, tears, or the sea." Stella paused. She knew that quote. Isak Dinesen. She turned back to him, but he had already stood, collecting the empty bowls. The conversation was over. She didn't mind because something told her that Lucas Kane was not a man to be figured out in a single night. And for the first time in a long time, that intrigued her. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the island, stretching its light across the calm waters. Stella stood barefoot on the wooden dock, coffee cup in hand, watching as Lucas worked on a fishing boat a few yards away. His movements were methodical, practiced, like a man who had spent a lifetime fixing things. She had only planned to stay one night. Just a quick stop before heading back to the world she had built. But something about this place, about him, had made her hesitate. Now, as the second morning dawned, she found herself reluctant to leave. Lucas barely acknowledged her presence as he worked, his focus entirely on the boat before him. Stella had never met a man so comfortable in silence. In her world, people filled every pause with words, negotiations, pleasantries, distractions. But Lucas didn't waste breath on conversation that wasn't necessary. Strangely, she found it refreshing. "You always this talkative?" she finally asked, smirking as she took a sip of her coffee. Lucas glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. "Only when there's something worth saying," she chuckled, shaking her head. "And here I was thinking we were bonding." Lucas didn't smile, but something flickered in his eyes. "You staying or leaving?" It was a simple question, but it caught her off guard. She had spent years making decisions that affected thousands, investments, expansions, partnerships. Yet, this one moment of self-reflection felt strangely difficult. "I haven't decided," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. Lucas nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then make yourself useful." She raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Lucas jerked his chin toward a stack of wooden planks near the dock. "If you're gonna hang around, you can help. That boat's not gonna fix itself," Stella laughed. "You want me to work? You want breakfast?" Her amusement deepened. "So this is a trade system?" "Something like that." She looked at him for a long moment, then, before she could overthink it, she set her coffee down and walked toward the planks. "All right, Kane, let's see if I'm cut out for island life." As the morning stretched into afternoon, Stella found herself knee-deep in sawdust, learning how to sand. Wooden panels. It was painstaking, repetitive work, but there was something oddly satisfying about it, about seeing the smooth surface emerge beneath her hands. Lucas, ever the silent observer, occasionally corrected her technique, but offered little else in terms of instruction. "You're terrible at this," he remarked after her fifth failed attempt at getting the angle right. Stella shot him a glare. "Encouraging," he shrugged. "You own a yacht empire. Didn't think you'd know much about building them." She scoffed. "I know plenty about boats." Lucas leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "Yeah? What's the first thing you check on a damaged hull?" Stella opened her mouth, then shut it. She knew financial projections, fleet logistics, and brand marketing like the back of her hand. But the actual mechanics, not so much. Lucas smirked. "Thought so." She exhaled, dropping the sandpaper. "All right, fine, you win. But in my defense, I usually pay people to know that stuff." Lucas nodded, picking up a hammer. "That's the problem." His words struck deeper than she expected. For years, she had surrounded herself with experts, delegating every detail to specialists. She had built an empire based on efficiency and control. But here, on this small island, none of that mattered. Here, survival wasn't about delegating, it was about knowing. And maybe, for the first time, she was realizing how much she didn't know. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. Lucas glanced up from his work, frowning. Storm's coming. Stella followed his gaze, her stomach tightening at the sight. How bad? Bad enough. He set down his tools. Come on, we need to tie things down. The easy rhythm of the day was replaced with urgency as they moved to secure boats, reinforce the dock, and gather supplies. Stella followed Lucas's lead, mimicking his movements as best she could. The wind picked up quickly, whipping her hair into her face as they worked. The waves had already begun to swell, crashing harder against the shore. Lucas handed her a rope. Tie this off. Make it tight. Stella took it, fingers fumbling as she struggled to secure the knot. The wind howled around them, and she swore under her breath as the rope slipped from her grasp. Lucas was beside her in an instant, hands steady as he covered hers, guiding her through the knot. His skin was rough, his grip firm, steadying. There, he said, stepping back. Now it won't come loose. Stella swallowed, realizing how close they were standing. The storm raged around them, but for a fleeting moment all she could focus on was the man before her. Lucas's gaze met hers, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something. Unguarded in his expression, it was brief, barely there, but it was enough to make her breath catch. Then, just as quickly, he turned away. Come inside. It's about to hit. And just like that, the moment was gone. The storm hit with full force, just as they stepped into Lucas's cabin. The wind howled against the wooden walls, rain pelting the windows in relentless sheets. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Stella wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the chill. How long do these storms usually last? Lucas stoked the fire in the stove. Could be a few hours, could be all night. She exhaled, sinking into the chair across from him. The wind screamed outside, making the cabin feel impossibly small. Lucas handed her a dry blanket. Here. She took it without a word, draping it over her shoulders. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the storm outside. Then quietly, Lucas broke the silence. You're not just running from the world, are you? The question caught her off guard. She met his gaze, heart pounding. He wasn't just making conversation. He knew. For years she had kept her walls high, convinced that no one could see through them. But Lucas saw straight through her. She swallowed hard, unsure of what to say, so she said nothing. And for once, that silence felt like the most honest answer of all. The storm raged outside, howling through the trees, rattling the windows, and pounding the roof with relentless sheets of rain. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of burning wood, the flickering fire in the stove casting long shadows along the wooden walls. Stella sat near the fire, wrapped in the blanket Lucas had given her, fingers gripping the fabric tighter than necessary. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the storm outside or the one brewing inside her. Across from her, Lucas sat in his usual silence, one hand wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. He wasn't staring at her, but she could feel his presence. Like an anchor in the chaos, he had barely spoken since his question earlier. You're not just running from the world, are you? And she had given him no answer, because she didn't have one, or maybe she just wasn't ready to say it aloud. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Stella cleared her throat. How bad does it usually get? Lucas glanced toward the rattling window. Bad enough, but it'll pass. His words were steady, as if storms were just another part of life, something to endure, something temporary. She envied that certainty. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, watching the flames dance in the stove. You weren't surprised when I said I was out there alone. Lucas took a slow sip of his coffee. Didn't seem like something that surprised you either. She exhaled, leaning back against the chair. No, I suppose not. The truth was, loneliness had been a constant companion for years. People assumed that wealth and power meant a life filled with people, friends, lovers, admirers. But the higher she climbed, the fewer people she could truly trust. Conversations became transactions, relationships became strategic, and vulnerability became a weakness she couldn't afford. She glanced at Lucas. He was different. There was no pretense with him, no hidden agenda, just silence, honesty, and a quiet strength that unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making Stella flinch. Lucas stood, moving toward the window to check the storm's progress. It's shifting, he muttered. We're in the eye, she frowned. Meaning? Calm for a little while. Then it'll hit again. The wind outside had indeed died. And down, the eerie quiet settling over the island like an omen. Stella hesitated, then stood, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. Can I see? Lucas studied her for a moment before nodding. He grabbed an old oil lantern, lit it, and led her to the door. The moment he pushed it open, Stella inhaled sharply. The world outside was transformed. The sky was a deep, restless grey, but the ocean stretched out like liquid silver, reflecting the faint glow of the moon breaking through the clouds. The air smelled of rain and salt, the earth damp beneath her feet. She stepped forward instinctively, drawn by the sight of the waves lapping against the shore. It was hauntingly beautiful, wild, untamed, just like the man standing beside her. I can see why you stayed, she murmured. Lucas didn't answer right away. Then after a long pause, he said, You ever wonder what it's like to just let it all go? She turned to him. His gaze was fixed on the horizon. But there was something distant in his eyes, something that told her he wasn't just talking about her. You did, she said softly. Didn't you? Lucas let out a slow breath. Yeah. She wanted to ask him more. She wanted to pry into his past the way he had seen straight through hers. But something told her Lucas would only tell her when he was ready. So instead she simply said, For me, it's not that easy. Lucas finally looked at her. Why? She hesitated. Then, for the first time in years, she gave an honest answer. Because I don't know who I am without it. Lucas studied her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. You ever think maybe that's the problem? Before she could respond, a loud crack split through the sky. The wind roared back to life, whipping around them with violent force. Stella gasped as the first wave of rain hit, icy against her skin. Lucas grabbed her wrist. Inside. Now. They barely made it through the door before the storm crashed down in full force. The lantern flickered wildly, the wind pushing against the cabin walls, as if trying to rip them apart. Lucas bolted the door shut, then moved to check the windows. The fire in the stove swayed dangerously, its glow casting jagged shadows across the room. Stay away from the windows, he ordered. Stella nodded, her heart pounding harder than she cared to admit. She wasn't afraid of storms. But this was something else. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. Outside, branches snapped, the sound cutting through the air like gunfire. And then, a sudden, deafening crack. Lucas's head snapped toward the window. Damn it! Stella turned just in time to see the massive tree near the cabin splintering under the force of the wind, and it was falling right toward them. Impact. Lucas moved first. With a force that left no room for argument, he grabbed Stella and pushed her toward the farthest corner of the room, shielding her with his body just as the tree came crashing down. The impact was deafening. The cabin shook violently as wood splintered, part of the roof caving inward. Dust and debris rained down around them. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Stella's heart slammed against her ribs as she slowly lifted her head. Lucas was still holding on to her, his body a solid barrier between her and the wreckage. He exhaled sharply, his breath warm against her skin. "You okay?" She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah." Lucas pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands still braced on either side of her. There was a cut on his temple, a thin line of blood tracing down his cheek. Stella reached out instinctively. "You're hurt." Lucas caught her wrist gently, shaking his head. "I'm fine." The cabin was still standing, but the damage was undeniable. Part of the roof had collapsed, rain pouring through the jagged opening. They needed to move, to check the rest of the structure. But for a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm raged on outside, but inside, between them, something else had begun to stir, something neither of them was quite ready to name. The morning light filtered through the broken roof, casting a pale glow over the wreckage. The storm had passed, but its aftermath remained, a testament to the chaos of the night before. The once sturdy cabin now bore scars of the tempest, splintered beams, scattered debris, and a gaping hole where the ceiling used to be. Stella stood in the center of it all, arms crossed, taking in the damage. Her muscles ached from the tension of the night, but it was nothing compared to the storm still. Swirling inside her, Lucas, ever the pragmatist, was already at work. He moved with quiet efficiency, clearing debris, checking the structure, calculating what could be salvaged. "You could at least take a break," she said, watching as he lifted a fallen beam with a grunt. Lucas didn't glance up. Storms. Over. No point in waiting around. She exhaled, rubbing her arms. The island had returned to its calm, but between them a different kind of tension lingered. The kind that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with last night. The way he had shielded her, the way he had held on to her just a little too long, and the way she hadn't wanted to pull away. She turned, walking to the broken window, gazing out at the ocean. "Does this happen often?" Lucas set down the beam. "Storms? Yeah." She glanced over her shoulder. "I meant nights like last night." His hands stilled for just a fraction of a second before he resumed his work. "Not like that." Something in his voice made her chest tighten. She had spent her entire life surrounded by men who spoke in circles, executives, politicians, businessmen who mastered the art of saying nothing at all. But Lucas, he said little, but when he did, it was never empty. The silence stretched between them before Stella finally turned away from the window. "I should probably head back soon." Lucas didn't react. "I'll check your engine again." That should have been the end of it. A clean break, an easy exit, but she didn't move, because the truth was she wasn't ready to leave. They worked in silence for the next hour, Lucas repairing, Stella helping where she could. It was a strange rhythm, but it worked. At one point, she stepped outside to stretch her legs, walking toward the dock where her yacht was moored. She ran her fingers along the railing, contemplating the life that waited for her beyond this island. And then she heard it. A voice. Male. She turned sharply, spotting a group of men at the far end of the dock. Fishermen, judging by their weathered faces and sturdy builds. They were speaking in low voices, but one word caught her attention. Her name. Not just Stella. Her full name. She froze. "Stella Harrington, right? The one with the yacht company?" The words sent a jolt through her, sharp and immediate. Lucas, standing a few feet away, straightened. The fishermen turned, their curiosity plain. Recognition flickered in Lucas's eyes, and just like that the fragile balance between them shattered. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, unreadable as ever. But something had shifted. The easy silence between them was gone, replaced by something colder. "You own Harrington Yachts," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. She exhaled. "Yes." Lucas's jaw tightened. He turned back toward the cabin, as if dismissing the conversation entirely. Stella took a step forward. "It changes things, doesn't it?" He didn't answer. She huffed, frustration creeping into her voice. "Of course it does." Lucas finally stopped. He turned, and when he spoke, his voice was calm. Too calm. "You expect it not to?" She swallowed. "I didn't lie to you. You didn't tell me the truth either." Silence. Stella had spent her life controlling conversations, steering them where she wanted. But Lucas was different. He didn't argue, didn't lash out. He simply saw, and somehow that was worse. She forced herself to hold his gaze. "Does it matter?" Lucas studied her, then exhaled, running a hand over his face. "You think I don't know what companies like yours do?" Something in his tone sent a chill down her spine. "What are you talking about?" He turned away again, shaking his head. "Forget it." But Stella wasn't about to let this go. "No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to act like you suddenly know me because of a company name." Lucas stopped. His shoulders tensed, and when he turned back his eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. "My father was a fisherman," he said, voice measured, but heavy. "He lost everything when one of your luxury fleets expanded into his waters, couldn't compete, couldn't afford the new licenses. He went under. A year later he was gone." The words landed like a punch. Stella's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had never thought about it, never considered the ripple effects of what her company did beyond the glossy brochures and billion-dollar deals. "I didn't know," she said quietly. Lucas let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh. "No, you didn't." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Stella standing alone, for the first time in years, unsure of what to say. The ocean had never felt so vast. Stella gripped the wheel of her yacht as it cut through the waves, the island shrinking behind her. The sun glared off the water, but the warmth did nothing to chase away the cold knot in her chest. Lucas hadn't asked her to leave. He hadn't needed to. His words had done that for him. "My father was a fisherman. He lost everything when one of your luxury fleets expanded into his waters. A year later he was gone. She had spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, building an empire from the ground up, but she had never thought about the fisherman who had been left behind in the wake of her success. Stella Harrington wasn't used to guilt. She was used to control, to having answers. But this was unfamiliar territory. She tightened her grip on the wheel. Maybe leaving was the right choice. Maybe it was the only choice. But why did it feel like she was running away from something? She wasn't ready to lose. By the time she reached the marina, her world was waiting for her. A sleek black car was already parked at the dock, and the moment she stepped off the yacht, her assistant Evelyn rushed toward her. "Miss Harrington, thank God. We've been trying to reach you for days. You had a board meeting scheduled." "Cancel anything that's not urgent," Stella interrupted, running a hand through her wind-tangled hair. "I need time to what?" Evelyn blinked in confusion. To think, to breathe, to understand why leaving that island felt like she had left a piece of herself behind. Instead, Stella sighed, "Just reschedule the meetings." Evelyn hesitated before nodding, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the car. "Oh, and there's been some media chatter. Someone spotted your yacht near an uncharted island. The press is speculating." Stella clenched her jaw. "Ignore it." Evelyn's eyes flickered with curiosity, but she knew better than to ask. "Of course." As the car pulled away from the dock, Stella glanced back at the water, half expecting, half hoping to see a small, weathered boat trailing behind. But there was nothing. Lucas was gone, and she had no reason to return. Stella's penthouse was exactly as she had left it, pristine, luxurious and cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline, but after days on the island, it felt artificial. She poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the leather couch, kicking off her shoes. The familiar surroundings should have comforted. Her they didn't. Her phone buzzed. A message from her CFO finalized the acquisition deal. We're expanding into the South Atlantic. Contracts ready for your approval. Her stomach twisted. The South Atlantic. More waters claimed for luxury yachts. More fishermen like Lucas's father forced out. She set the phone down like it burned her. Was this what success had come to? Was this what she had fought for? The worst part was, Lucas was right. She had spent so long building her empire, so long ensuring she was untouchable, that she had never stopped to ask who was paying the price for it. She took a slow sip of wine, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in her life, victory felt hollow. Days passed, but the island still lingered in her mind. She saw it in the stillness of the early mornings when the city hadn't fully woken. She heard it in the distant crash of waves against the harbor, and she felt it every time she closed her eyes. She dreamed of rough hands guiding hers over a fraying rope, the scent of sawdust and sea salt, the warmth of a fire flickering in a storm. Lucas. She told herself it was ridiculous. She had known him for a handful of days. He was a man who had cut himself off from the world, who had no reason to trust her, but somehow she couldn't forget the way he had looked at her, not as Stella Harrington, CEO, but just Stella. And she wasn't sure she had ever truly been seen before. One evening, as she sat on her balcony, staring out at the endless stretch of ocean, Evelyn approached with a folder in hand. "Miss Harrington, I need you to sign off on the South Atlantic acquisition." Stella didn't move. Evelyn hesitated. "Should I leave it here?" A long silence. Then Stella took the folder. She ran her fingers over the crisp edges, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. For the first time in years, she didn't immediately sign. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, "What if we did something different?" Evelyn frowned. "Different how?" Stella turned, her mind suddenly clear. She didn't know how, not yet, but she knew one thing: she needed to go back. The warm Miami breeze drifted through the open balcony doors, but Stella barely felt it. The folder in her hands, the South Atlantic acquisition, sat heavy on her lap, a stark reminder of everything she had built and everything she might have, destroyed along the way. For days, she had turned the decision over in her mind. Every logical part of her knew the answer: sign the papers, expand the business, win. It was what she had always done. It was what made her one of the most powerful women in the industry. But then she thought of Lucas, his father, the fisherman, who had lost their livelihoods, their homes, because of decisions just like this one. And suddenly, winning didn't feel like enough anymore. Evelyn knocked softly before stepping onto the balcony. "Ms. Harrington, the board is expecting your final approval on the deal." Stella ran a hand through her hair, exhaling slowly. "What happens to the local fishermen if we take this expansion?" Evelyn hesitated. "Well, I assume some of them would be displaced. We'd be buying out independent ports, replacing them with high-end marinas for our clients." Stella already knew the answer, but hearing it out loud made it harder to ignore. She glanced at the folder again. She had spent years making calculated choices, ensuring her empire thrived. But she had never considered the names and faces of those left in the shadows of her success, until now. "What if," she said slowly, "instead of taking their waters, we worked with them?" Evelyn frowned. "I don't understand." Stella stood, suddenly feeling like she had been asleep for years and had only just woken up. "What if we partnered with the fishermen, created programs to help them keep their businesses instead of wiping them out?" Evelyn blinked. "You mean charity?" "No," Stella said firmly. "Investment." Evelyn hesitated before choosing her words carefully. With all due respect, the board won't go for this. The shareholders expect growth, not goodwill. Stella met her gaze. Then we give them both. For the first time in a long time, Stella felt something she hadn't in years. Purpose, and just like that, she knew what she had to do. The next day, Stella found herself standing in a place she had never set foot in before, a small fishing port on the outskirts of the city, a world away from the luxury marinas she usually visited. It smelled of salt and diesel, of sweat and hard labor. The docks were lined with rusting boats, nets tangled and worn from years of use. She felt out of place, and she hated that she did. The fisherman watched her with cautious eyes as she walked along the docks, her designer shoes clicking against the weathered wood. She stopped when she saw an older man repairing a fishing net by hand. His skin was darkened by the sun, his hands rough with years of work. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the dock master?" The man looked up, eyes sharp. "Depends on who's asking." She extended a hand. "Stella Harrington." The man didn't shake it. Instead, he studied her, recognition flickering in his expression. "You're the yacht lady," she exhaled. "That's one way to put it." The man snorted. "What's a billionaire doing in a place like this? Looking to buy us out too?" A month ago she might have. Now she shook her head. "No, I want to help." The man let out a dry laugh. "That's a new one." Stella crouched down so they were eye level. "What if I told you that my company could work with you instead of against you? What if we funded programs to modernize your boats, invest in your trade, and make sure your communities weren't pushed out?" The man narrowed his eyes. "And why the hell would you do that?" She thought of Lucas, of his father, of all the lives that had been changed, destroyed, because people like her had never thought to ask that question. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply. The dockmaster studied her for a long moment before shaking his head with a small chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned." Stella left the docks that day with a plan forming in her mind, one that no boardroom had ever prepared her for. She was going to fight for something other than profit, and she had a feeling that the first person she needed to convince wasn't her board. It was Lucas. It was time to go back to the island. The waves stretched endlessly before her, the rhythmic rocking of the yacht, a familiar sensation beneath her feet. But this time, the journey felt different. Stella stood at the helm, gripping the wheel, eyes locked on the horizon. The island was out there, somewhere beyond the endless blue, beyond the doubts whispering in her mind. She had left thinking she would never return. Now, she was coming back with a purpose. The past week had been a revelation. She had spent years making decisions based on growth, profit, and power, never considering the lives those decisions impacted. But standing on that weathered dock, talking to men who had fought every day just to survive, she had seen the truth. Lucas had been right, and if she was going to change things, she needed to start with him. As the island's jagged cliffs came into view, Stella felt a wave of unease tighten in her chest. Would he even listen to her? After the way they had left things, after the truth that had come out, would he shut the door in her face? She pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. She had faced billion-dollar deals, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes negotiations. She could face one man, even if that man was the only person who had ever truly made her question herself. She anchored the yacht a few yards from shore and climbed into the small dinghy, rowing toward the dock. The salty wind tugged at her hair, the distant cry of gulls filling the heavy silence. When she finally stepped onto the island, the place looked just as she had left it, unchanged, steady, like the tide itself. Except for one thing. Lucas was waiting. He stood at the edge of the dock, arms crossed over his chest, watching as she approached. She had no idea how long he had been there. Had he seen the yacht on the horizon? Had he known she would return, or was he simply waiting to send her away? She stepped onto the dock, gripping the railing for balance. "Lucas!" His gaze was unreadable, the sea-grey eyes giving nothing away. "Didn't expect to see you again." Stella forced herself to hold his stare. "I wasn't sure I'd come back." Lucas didn't move, didn't react. "But you did." She nodded. "I have something to say." For a moment, she thought he might refuse her outright. But then, after a long pause, he turned. "Come inside." The cabin felt smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she had changed. Lucas moved to the stove, lighting the fire with practiced ease. Stella stood near the window, watching him, searching for any sign of the man who had held onto her in the middle of a storm. She finally spoke. "I went to the docks." Lucas didn't look up. "What docks?" "The fishing docks near Miami. I talked to the men who lost everything when companies like mine moved in." Lucas stilled. "I wanted to understand," she continued, "not just the numbers, not just the business side of it, but the people." Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. "And what? You felt bad for a few days and decided to play the hero?" Stella flinched but held her ground. "No, I decided to change things." His jaw tightened, but he remained silent. She took a step forward. "I'm not here for some grand gesture, Lucas. I know what my company has done. I know what it's cost people, like your father, and I know I can't fix the past." Lucas finally met her gaze. "But I can change the future," she said softly. She pulled a folder from her bag and set it on the table. Lucas eyed it warily. "What is this?" "A plan," she said. "A real one." Lucas hesitated, then opened it. His eyes scanned the pages, detailed blueprints, financial breakdowns, an entire initiative designed to work with small fishing communities instead of erasing them. She continued, voice steady. "I want to take the money my company would have used to buy out these waters and use it to help rebuild them instead. New boats, modern equipment, training programs, not as a handout, but as an investment in the people who belong there." Lucas flipped through the pages, silent. Then he looked up. "And the board? The investors?" "I convinced them," she said simply. Lucas let out a breath. Just like that, Stella gave him a small, almost amused smile. "You underestimate me, Kane." Something flickered in his expression, a crack in the distance he had built between them. Lucas set the folder down, rubbing a hand over his face. "You actually did this?" "I did." Silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't cold. It was something else, something shifting. Finally, Lucas leaned back, studying her with the same intensity as the first time they had met. "And you came here," he murmured, "because you wanted me to know." She swallowed. "I came here because I wanted you to believe me." Lucas held her gaze for a long moment, then exhaled a slow, measured breath. "Damn it, Harrington," he muttered. And this time, when he looked at her, really looked at her, it wasn't with anger. It was something else, entirely. Lucas had always believed that people didn't change. Not really. They adapted, they adjusted, but at their core, they remained who they had always been. But as he sat across from Stella, flipping through the pages of the proposal she had placed, before him he realized maybe he had been wrong, because the woman standing in his cabin now wasn't the same Stella Harrington who had arrived on the island days ago, stranded on a broken yacht. This Stella had fought battles he couldn't see. Battles against a world that thrived on power and control, against a system she had once built, but now wanted to rewrite. And the worst part? He wanted to believe her. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Stella sat opposite him, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. But Lucas had learned to recognize the quiet determination in her eyes. "Why are you really here?" he finally asked, closing the folder. She exhaled. "I told you. Want you to see what I'm trying to do. That's not what I meant." Silence stretched between them. Lucas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You could have sent this in an email. You didn't need to come all the way back here." Stella looked down for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Then, when she finally met his gaze again, her voice was softer. "I needed to see you." The admission was quiet, almost hesitant. Lucas studied her, feeling the weight of those words settle between them. For years, he had lived on this island, convinced that distance was the only way to keep himself from getting hurt again. But here she was, someone who should have been his opposite in every way, standing on the other side of that divide, and for the first time in years, he didn't want to push her away. "Come with me," he said suddenly, standing. Stella blinked. "Where?" He grabbed his jacket and nodded toward the door. "You want me to believe you? Let's take a walk." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. They stepped outside, the salty breeze rolling in from the ocean. The storm had left its mark. Broken branches littered the shoreline. The dock still bore signs of the fierce winds, but the island itself remained steady. Much like Lucas, much like her, in a way, she was only now beginning to understand. They walked in silence at first, past the familiar stretch of beach where they had first met, past the boats Lucas had spent years repairing. Then, as they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea, Lucas finally spoke. "My dad used to take me here when I was a kid," he said, his voice distant. "Before things got bad." Stella glanced at him surprised. He rarely spoke about his past. She waited, letting him take his time. He loved the ocean, said it was the only place where everything made sense. Lucas let out a slow breath. "Then we lost everything. The fishing business, the house. He never recovered from it." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Lucas shook his head. "It's not about apologies. It's about knowing that what you do, what your company does, it affects real people, not just numbers on a report." "I know that now," she said softly. "I should have known it sooner." He turned to face her. "And you really think you can change it?" She met his gaze without hesitation. Yes. The wind whipped around them, the waves crashing below, and for the first time, Lucas believed her. They made their way back toward the cabin, the silence between them no longer heavy, but something else entirely, something unfinished. When they reached the porch, Stella hesitated. "This isn't just about the company, is it?" Lucas asked quietly. She let out a breath. "No." Lucas stepped closer. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, wasn't someone who needed flowery words to understand what was happening. He had spent years shutting the world out. But standing in front of Stella now, he knew one thing for certain. Some things were worth letting in. "Stay," he murmured. Stella's heart pounded. "For how long?" Lucas gave a small, almost amused smirk. "Guess we'll figure that out together." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Stella knew she wasn't leaving this time. The island was different at dusk. Golden light stretched across the water, casting shimmering reflections that made the waves look almost like liquid fire. The air smelled of salt and fresh earth, and the only sound was the distant call of seabirds and the gentle lapping of the tide against the dock. Lucas stood at the edge of the beach, his hands in his pockets, watching Stella as she moved along the shoreline. She had been here for a few days now, longer than either of them had planned, and yet neither had spoken about what came next. For a man who had spent years living in solitude, Lucas found himself strangely at ease with her presence. She fit into his world in a way that shouldn't have made sense, but somehow it did. Even now, as she kneeled beside an old wooden boat, running her fingers along its hull with a thoughtful expression, he found himself watching her, not with skepticism, but with something he wasn't ready to name. "You think it'll hold?" Stella asked, nodding toward the boat. Lucas smirked, stepping closer. "You doubting my work?" She glanced up at him, amusement in her eyes. "I wouldn't dare." The boat was one of the last remaining from the old fisherman who had once made a living here. The paint had faded, the wood weathered by years of exposure, but it still stood, a symbol of what once was, and maybe of what could be again. She ran a hand over the worn planks. "You said your father believed the ocean made sense." Lucas nodded. "Yeah," she met his gaze. "Then let's give it back to the people who need it." Lucas studied her, waiting for her to explain. Stella stood, brushing sand off her hands. "I don't just want to change my company's approach. I want to start something real, a program that works with fishermen, not just to preserve what they have, but to expand it. New boats, new techniques, sustainable fishing, training for the next generation." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You just come up with that?" She grinned. "No, I've been thinking about it for days." Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. "You really don't give up, do you? Not when something's worth fighting for." A pause. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." The next morning they got to work. Lucas had spent years repairing boats, but this was different. This wasn't just fixing something broken. It was building something new. They stripped the old boat down, assessing what could be salvaged and what needed replacing. Stella worked alongside him, hands covered in sawdust, sweat beading at her temples. She wasn't afraid of the work, and Lucas found that he respected that more than anything. At one point, she wiped her forehead with the back of her arm and smirked. "I think I'm getting the hang of this." Lucas glanced at the uneven nails she had hammered in and chuckled. "Sure you are." She swatted his arm, laughing. It was easy, natural. And for a moment Lucas let himself forget that this wasn't a life she was meant for, that sooner or later she'd have to go back. That night, after the tools were put away and the fire crackled, inside the cabin, Stella sat on the porch, watching the waves. Lucas stepped outside, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He handed her one, then leaned against the railing beside her. "You really think this will work?" he asked. She took a sip of coffee. "I do." He nodded, staring out at the water. "You could have just gone back to your life and forgotten about all this." Stella exhaled. "I tried." Lucas turned to her, and she met his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. "And I realized I didn't want to." Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then Lucas looked back at the ocean. "You see that out there?" He pointed toward a distant light flickering in the darkness. "A lighthouse," she guessed. He nodded. "It's been there forever. Ships use it to find their way." Stella tilted her head. "Is this a metaphor?" Lucas smirked. "Maybe." She glanced back at the lighthouse, the steady glow standing firm against the Black Sea, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had found her own beacon in the dark. A reason to stay, a reason to fight, and maybe, just maybe, a reason to love. The first light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of gold and lavender. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, calm and infinite, as if the storm that had once raged, both in the skies and in their lives, had never existed. Stella stood on the dock, the salty breeze tousling her hair, her hands resting on the smooth railing of the newly restored boat. It was finally ready. Lucas stepped up beside her, hands in his pockets, his gaze following the gentle rise and fall of the waves. "She's seaworthy," he said, nodding toward the boat. "Took longer than I thought, but it'll hold." Stella turned to him, a small smile playing at her lips. "It's beautiful." He smirked. "It's functional." She laughed softly. "Same thing." For weeks, they had worked side by side, rebuilding more than just a boat. They had built a future, one neither of them had expected, and today was the day they set it into motion. The island's fishermen had gathered on the shore, their faces lined with curiosity and cautious hope. Some of them had lost everything to the changing tides of the industry, victims of corporations like Stella's. But today, they weren't losing anything. Today, they were getting it back. Stella stepped forward, holding the thick rope that secured the boat to the dock. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice steady. "We start here, with one boat, one community, and from here we grow." The dockmaster, the same man who had once met her with suspicion, crossed his arms and nodded. "You're serious about this?" She met his gaze. "Completely." Lucas, standing beside her, added, "She doesn't do anything halfway." The dockmaster chuckled. "Guess we'll see about that." Then, with a small nod, he took the rope from her hands and tied the final knot, a symbol of trust, of something new. As the last of the fishermen drifted back to their boats, Lucas turned to Stella. "So, what now?" She inhaled deeply, letting the salty air fill her lungs. "Now, I go back." Lucas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Thought you might." She looked at him then, really looked at him. The man who had saved her during the storm. The man who had challenged her to see beyond her world. The man who had, without meaning to, made her feel more than she had in years. "I'm not going back to leave," she said softly. Lucas tilted, his head studying her. "Then why?" she smiled. "Because there's still work to do." And there was. She had a company to reshape, partnerships to build, promises to keep. She had spent years building an empire. Now it was time to build something meaningful. Lucas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. And after that, her smile widened. "Then I come back." A beat of silence. Then, to her surprise, Lucas smiled too. They stood at the edge of the dock, the world stretching wide before them. "This place changes people," Lucas murmured. Stella glanced at him. "It changed you." He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "It changed me too." Lucas looked down at their joined hands, then at her. "You sure you're coming back?" She squeezed his fingers gently. "I don't belong in just one world anymore." And for the first time, Lucas believed her. The boat rocked gently in the water, waiting for its maiden voyage. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. "Guess I'll be here," she smirked. "Guess you will." The sun rose higher, casting golden light over the island, over the ocean, over them. And as Stella stepped onto her yacht, setting a course for a future she was ready to rewrite, she knew one thing for certain. Some journeys don't end. They just find new horizons. And that, my friends, is the story of The Lighthouse Between Us. A journey of love, redemption, and the unexpected ways kindness can change our lives. But now we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. It's always amazing to see how stories like this connect people from all over the world. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Was it Lucas's quiet strength, Stella's transformation, or the idea that sometimes the things we're searching for have been right in front of us all along? And if you enjoyed this story and want more heartfelt, uplifting tales, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss a new story that just might touch your heart. Thank you so much for being here, for watching, for sharing a moment of your time with us. Your support means everything. Until next time, may you always find your own lighthouse guiding you home.